The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, while Elena stood at the center of it all, surrounded by eyes that saw only what they were told to see. The murmurs had grown into a steady hum that pressed against her skull, and the voice of the judge rolled over her like distant thunder. His words sharp and final, as if carved into stone. He called her a coward. He called her unworthy of the uniform she had once worn with pride, and she could hear the rustle of papers, the shifting of shoes, the low gasp from somewhere behind her, where reporters sat, waiting to turn her shame into a headline. She did not move. She did not blink. She let the words settle into the quiet corners of her mind, because she had been called worse. She had been called traitor, ghost liar survivor, and none of it compared to the weight of the truth she could never speak. She remembered the night when everything changed, the mission that was never supposed to. Remembered the silence of the desert broken by the distant hum of engines and the pulse in her ears. Each heartbeat a drum that marked how close they were to the edge. The men beside her trusted her. They followed her voice through the static, through the dark, through the fear. And when the order came to retreat, she was the one who disobeyed. Because there was still a signal, still a life on the other side of the ridge. She had gone back alone. And when she returned, she was not the same. The light in her eyes had dimmed. The sound of her name felt heavier, as though spoken by someone else entirely. Now in this room full of polished wood and stale air, she stood accused not by strangers, but by those who had once sworn to stand with her. She could feel the judge trying to pierce her silence, as if her stillness were an insult. His voice grew louder, his questions sharper, demanding an explanation, demanding remorse. But there was none to give. She could not tell him that the mission had never failed, that someone out there still breathed because of her. She could not tell him that she had been ordered to forget, that her courage had been buried under layers of secrecy and denials. She could not even tell him about the whisper that came through her radio minutes before dawn, a voice saying her name, and then a code word that had not been spoken since her training began. The flash of that night haunted her every second, the way the fire burned against the sand, the way the wind carried ash and screams, the way the silence returned after everything was gone. She had walked through the wreckage with her weapon drawn, but there was nothing left to fight. Only the ghost of choices and the echo of commands that never should have been given. She had waited for rescue, but it never came. She had found her own way out, carrying more than the weight of her gear, carrying the memory of every name she could not save. She had filed her report like she was told, and watched as her story was rewritten piece by piece until even she barely recognized it. The judge spoke again, calling her derelict, accusing her of cowardice for leaving her post, for abandoning her team, for failing to follow orders. His words twisted the truth into something monstrous, and she felt her throat tighten. But she did not speak, because to defend herself would be to betray everything she had promised. To protect her silence was her last act of loyalty, and it burned through her like fire. She watched the spectators lean forward, hungry for shame and scandal. She saw the flash of cameras, the flicker of pens moving across notebooks, and she wondered how easily they could all forget what it meant to be human, to be afraid to make choices that no one would ever understand. A woman in the front row stared at her, eyes wide, with something that looked like pity or recognition. Elena could not tell. Maybe she too had lost someone. Maybe she too had learned that truth and justice were not the same thing. She wanted to tell her that she was sorry. Sorry for everything, for surviving, for staying silent, for standing here now with the word coward echoing around her like a curse. But the words refused to form. Her mouth was dry, her heart loud enough to drown out the rest of the world. The judge leaned forward, his tone softening only slightly, as he asked her if she had anything to say, any defense, any reason why the court should not strip her of every honor, every memory of what she once was. She raised her eyes finally and looked at him directly. The first time since the hearing began, His expression faltered for a moment, because there was something in her stare, something unbroken, something that refused to yield. She wanted to tell him about the sound of a heartbeat through the static, about the moment she realized that courage was not about following orders, but about facing what no one else could. But instead, she said nothing. Her silence stretched across the room, until even the lights seemed to hum quieter. Outside the courthouse, the city moved as if none of this mattered. Cars passed, sirens wailed. People hurried to places that had nothing to do with war or duty or sacrifice inside the walls, though time felt frozen. Her entire life condensed into this moment, this accusation, this impossible demand for a truth. She could never speak. She thought of the faces of her team, their laughter before the storm, their voices fading one by one into static and smoke. She had carried them with her every day, and now she stood alone, judged by those who had never seen. What she had seen, never felt what it meant to lose everything for the sake of something invisible. The judge sighed, his patience thinning as he turned to the clerk, his gavel ready to strike and declare what the papers would call final justice. Elena felt the world slow as she heard the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the shuffle of someone standing in the back, the sound barely registered over the noise in her head. But it was there, steady, deliberate, a rhythm that pulled her back from the edge. She closed her eyes and remembered that voice on the radio, the one that had said her name just before dawn. She wondered if it would come again, if somehow after all this time someone still remembered. Her breathing steadied, and though the courtroom waited for her collapse, she remained standing, the word coward still hanging in the air, but no longer heavy, no longer sharp. It had lost its power, because she knew who she was. She knew what she had done and what she had kept buried to protect those who could not protect themselves. She had faced worse than this. She had walked through fire and silence and come out alive, her heart still beating even when no one else could hear it. The judge lifted the gavel. His lips parted to speak, but she barely saw him now. The walls, the people, the cameras, all blurred together. She thought of the code name whispered once through the static, the one that still lingered in her bones. She thought of the promise it carried and the truth it concealed. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace. Even as the world condemned her, she was still standing. She was still silent, and somewhere out there, someone still knew. The gavel struck once, and the echo rolled across the room like distant thunder. But before the judge could speak again, a sound rose from the back, a low, rough voice that cut through the air and silenced the murmurs. The single phrase drifted forward, soft yet heavy. Call sign, Raven 1. The courtroom froze, as though the walls themselves understood the weight of those words. Elena lifted her head, her breath catching as every memory returned the missions. The silence, the code that no one had spoken in years. The judge blinked, confusion clouding his stern face before it melted into something close to fear. The man who had spoken stepped forward, his uniform pressed thou old, his face marked by lines of duty, his eyes locked on Elena as if he were seeing a ghost. The guards hesitated, uncertain whether to stop him, but he raised a trembling hand and repeated the phrase again, Raven 1, the name that was never supposed to be heard outside the classified reports. It was the name given to her team, the name buried with the ones who never came home. The room shifted from accusation to disbelief as whispers broke out one after another. Who is he? What does it mean? Why does she react like that? Elena could feel her pulse in her throat, her hands cold against the wood before her. The judge demanded an explanation. His voice cracking under the strain, the man in uniform saluted, then spoke with a steadiness that silenced even the cameras. He said, "She is no coward. She is the reason any of us lived that night, and the reason this nation still sleeps safely. She disobeyed an order that would have doomed us all. She carried one of us through the fire, through the blast zone. While the rest of us waited for death, she never left her post. She saved it. The court went still as the truth pressed itself against every heart in that room. The judge sank back in his chair, the papers before him trembling as if they too rejected their own words. The spectators looked at Elena differently now, the hatred and judgment fading into shock and guilt. The reporter in the corner lowered her. Penn, the woman in the front row, covered her mouth, tears forming behind her glasses. The air seemed to grow colder, as if time itself was ashamed of what it had witnessed. The man in uniform took a slow breath, his eyes wet with the ghosts of memory. He said her silence was not cowardice. It was loyalty she was ordered to forget, and she did to protect us all, to protect what we did, to protect the truth that should never have been buried. Elena felt her throat tighten again, but this time not. From fear, the noise around her faded until only his voice remained, and with it the sound of the past roaring back. She could see the flames again, the desert again, the face of the soldier she had carried through the smoke, the same man who now stood. Before her older, slower alive, she had thought he had died that night. She had carried his broken body and left him behind when the second explosion came. Yet here he was, breathing, standing, defending her in front of the world. She did not know whether to cry or fall or speak. The judge cleared his throat, his authority cracked and fragile. He looked at the man, then at Elena. His lips parted, but no sound came at last. He set the gavel down gently, as though afraid of breaking the silence that now held the room. He said softly, "The court will adjourn indefinitely," and those words released the tension that had bound them all. Elena stood there as people began to rise slowly, uncertainly. Reporters no longer sure what to write, guards no longer sure whom to protect. She looked at the man one last time, and he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper when he said, "We never forgot Raven 1. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned gray, the air cool with the promise of rain. Elena stepped into it, the crowd parting around her. She could feel the stares, but they no longer pierced her. She walked down the steps slowly, each one a reminder that she was free, not forgiven, not redeemed, but seen. She reached the bottom and stopped the sound of rain beginning to fall, light soft cleansing. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since that night, she breathed without the weight of silence, without the fear of what would come next, because the truth had found its way through the noise. At last, and somewhere behind her, the echo of the words Raven 1 still lingered like a heartbeat refusing to die.